Progress.
All right. Matt, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Susie, can everyone hear me? I know there was a little audio confusion there.
Can you all hear him?
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right,
So-
give us 1 minute. Matt,
Okay.
we're gonna try, their folks said they couldn't hear. Try again?
Testing. 1, 2, 3, testing. Can you hear me now? Testing.
Yeah, I'm gonna sit here with the mic at the
Okay.
speaker.
All right. Sounds good. Well, let me just say to you all that you are incredibly fortunate to have Susie as one of your leaders. She is one of my favorite people in the world, and she will be a great resource for you in the coming troubles. So I was asked to speak about Christian nationalism and this election. So I like to, when I speak on this, start by defining terms, because I feel like there's a lot of talk about Christian nationalism, and some of it useful and some of it not so useful. So what are we even talking about when we're talking about American Christian nationalism? I like to draw on the biological sciences to think about this and use kind of a simple taxonomy. If you remember all the way back to school, the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order kind of schema for how we categorize different plants and animals. So I think if we start at the level of family, here we are speaking about religious nationalisms. And this is not unique to Christianity. This is not unique to the United States. This is a genre of different ways of people blending national political identities with their religious identities. And if we think, and then within that, there's different forms of Christian nationalism, right? The Christian nationalism in Russia looks very different than in the United States, looks very different than in Hungary, looks very different than in Nigeria, looks very different than in Brazil. All of those are forms of Christian nationalism. But in the US, we have a particular species of Christian nationalism, or maybe even multiple species of Christian nationalism at play within the US today. But globally, if we're thinking at the largest scale, religious nationalisms are on the rise. This is not unique to the United States, not unique to Christianity. You have the Hindutva, Hindu nationalist movement in India. You have Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar or Sri Lanka. And you have one of the global experts on Buddhist nationalism in your room with you there today. You have religious Zionism in Israel. You have, as I was saying, Christian nationalism on the rise in Brazil and Hungary and Russia and all kinds of places in Africa and also in Asia. So we're grappling right now with a global moment of surging religious nationalism. And within the United States, when we talk about this, how we think about Christian nationalism often hinges on this statement that America is or should be a Christian nation. And that can mean different things to different people. And so we almost always have to tease out what somebody means when they talk about Christian nationalism. It could mean just on a factual level, Christians make up a majority of the US population, which is just true, right? Like that has always been true in the United States. Today, it's around 63, 64% of the US population identifies as Christian. Now, if we press beyond that, though, a lot of people, when they talk about Christian nationalism or America should be a Christian nation, are making a statement, a philosophical or essentialist statement that the US was founded as a Christian nation on Christian principles. And this is usually rooted in some very gauzy theological or mythical renderings of American history that highlight the faith of the founding fathers without really acknowledging just how many of them had very little, if no, faith. And then if even beyond that, we could talk about the idea that Christians and/or Christianity should be privileged over other communities or worldviews in America. And that, I would argue, is an anti-democratic form of Christian supremacy. And that's where I want to move us this morning as we think about these questions. So even as we think about there's many kinds of Christian nationalism, I think we also have to recognize there's a spectrum of radicalism, of extremism within the realm of Christian nationalism. And it ranges from what I would call a kind of soft form of Christian nationalism that's more passive, more sympathetic to democracy, more sentimental. I grew up in going to evangelical churches where almost always there would be in the chancel on the stage a Christian flag and an American flag. right? And that is an expression of Christian nationalism. It doesn't keep me up at night. It's not my cup of tea. It's not what I would prefer in my church service. Or many Christians love to sing "God Bless America," right? That is a soft expression of Christian nationalism, but again, not a grave threat to American democracy, but a thread of thinking about America that has always been present throughout our history. Now, if we move towards the more hardline end of Christian nationalism in the United States, then we start thinking about these more organized, more anti-democratic, and actually more theological versions of Christian nationalism that I would call Christian supremacy. And so here you see an American flag alongside a Christian flag at the January 6th insurrection, right? Now we're talking about something that is a real and potent threat to American democracy, what was part of an organizing structure to attempt an overturning of our own government in the last election cycle. So soft Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists might vote along similar lines, but what distinguishes them is the severity of the perceived threat that they see to American Christianity. And when you start getting into these Christian supremacist circles, the language of violence is very present there. And they want to see Christianity enshrined in the American government, and they are quite ready to do extreme things to make that the case. And so when we talk about radicalization within American Christianity, we're talking about people moving from these forms of soft, kind of passive Christian nationalism into these more hardened ideologies of Christian supremacy, and beginning to think that they need to impose Christianity on the nation. So I'm going to make two statements, one of which I'm sure will be immediately recognizable to you as just factually true, and the second, which is a parallel statement that many people find very controversial today, but I think is also just simply factually true. So the first statement that hopefully there'll be no disagreement with is that the decline of white dominance in the United States has produced a white nationalist and white supremacist backlash, right? And this is a chart from the census. 1990, you had more than 3/4 of Americans identifying as white. And by 2020, it was down under 60%, right around 58% of the country identifying as white. And as white people in the United States, not all white people, but some fraction of white people perceive that as a threat to their dominance, to their cultural power, we see a backlash against that, right? In the form of, say, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where you have white supremacist and white nationalist voices marching in the streets. And what are they chanting? You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us, right? They're hearkening back to some of the darkest episodes in American history, some of the deep racism, the deep religious bias and bigotry, the deep anti-Semitism that is embedded within our culture. So hopefully there's no disagreement on that statement, but this is the more controversial parallel statement that in the same way, the decline of Christian dominance in the United States has produced a Christian nationalist and Christian supremacist backlash. So here, this is data from the General Social Survey, because the US Census doesn't really ask religion questions. But you can see up until 1990, about 90% of the US population was identifying as Christian. And then that began to precipitously drop off at the end of the Cold War. And we can have different theories as to why, starting around 1990, suddenly fewer and fewer people were identifying as Christian, but it's down to, as I said, around 63, 64% today. And so, unfortunately, we are not as far along as a society in recognizing that Christian nationalism is operating in parallel and sometimes overlapping with this Christian or white nationalist and white supremacist strand of our politics. But there are many people in our country who still claim that Christian nationalism is a myth or a political term meant to castigate conservative Christians. But just as there are elements within the white majority that still exist in the US that are pushing back and trying to hold on to white privilege and white power, there are elements within the Christian majority that still exist in the US who are pushing back and trying to hold on to Christian privilege and Christian power. And in a democracy, majorities are never more dangerous than when they fear they are losing their majority, because they still have the power to do something about it. And I would argue that what we witnessed on January 6th was part of this backlash of white nationalists, white supremacists, Christian nationalists, and Christian supremacists trying to hold on to power in the form of their avatar, Donald Trump. Now, what we did witness on January 6th, and I'm highlighting here especially some of the Christian symbols, we saw evangelical symbols, evangelical songs, evangelical Bible interpretations, evangelical prayers punctuating these crowds around the US Capitol. We saw Christians blowing shofars, these ram's horns that are originate within Jewish liturgical usage. But then you have Christians who've appropriated this as a symbol of Christian nationalism, as a symbol of Christian conquest. We saw Christian flags. That same flag that was in the front of the chancel of my church growing up, I went to Christian school and I grew up pledging allegiance to the American flag every morning and then pledging allegiance to the Christian flag every morning. And yet that is one of the potent symbols that was being used to perpetuate this insurrection. We saw Christians singing worship songs just yards away from an ongoing riot, people engaging in Christian worship while in the background, Capitol police officers are being beaten. We saw signs that say, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, as though for some people, apparently, those two thoughts are inseparable. And so as I have tried to dig into and understand the forces that drove, especially the Christian side of January 6th, I have discovered that there were dozens of what we would call independent, charismatic Christian leaders in the crowds surrounding the Capitol on January 6th. And these range, I've identified at least 60 of these folks. They range from everywhere from a local church pastor to global celebrity, who is people who are well known by millions of people around the world were present on January 6th. And what they were doing that day is they were doing spiritual warfare. They were leading prayer efforts. They were leading worship. They were using violent rhetoric in support of Trump's election lies. So let me unpack a little bit what I mean by independent charismatic, because that phrase might be kind of obscure to some folks. So when we talk about charismatic, of course, in the Christian tradition, we're not speaking about people who just have a magnetic personality or are entertaining, right? We're talking about we go back to the New Testament Greek, right? The charismas, the charismatas, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. This is a language that we get from especially the letters, the epistles of Paul. But to be charismatic today is to focus especially on the supernatural elements of those gifts, right? So to be charismatic is to have the spirituality that is built around recapturing the supernatural experiences that charismatics believe were essential to the life of the early church. Now, when we say independent here, that's a synonym for non-denominational. So these are churches and ministries and leaders who are not attached to a bureaucracy or to the accountability or governance of denominational bodies. These are folks who are kind of freewheeling and they're out doing their own thing. And so when you get the intersection of this charismatic spirituality with non-denominational governance, what emerges from that is the fastest growing segment of American Christianity. In fact, the fastest growing segment of global Christianity. Experts estimate that in 1970, there were 44 million independent charismatics in the world. By 2020, they estimated it was up to 312 million. So we're talking about a segment of Christianity that is roughly doubling in size every 20 years. And that's also true within the US. This is as far as we can tell, this is the only form of Christianity that's growing in the United States. This is a community that is ethnically diverse and globally connected. It's not only in the United States. In fact, the US is just one outpost of these ideas and these practices. You can see the same things going on in Brazil, in Africa, in Sub-Saharan, or in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, right? In Russia, right? These things are spreading around the world quite rapidly. This is the realm of televangelists and mega churches and celebrity preachers. I sometimes talk about it as the Silicon Valley of the American church, in that it's extremely innovative, it's extremely energetic. You've got a lot of fascinating personalities in the mix, but there's very few guardrails, very little regulation, very little kind of accountability of any sort in this world. And that what this does is it creates a form of Christian nationalism that's driven by belief in prophecy, modern prophecy, and also supernatural expectations of God's intervention in human history and especially in American history. Now, how can you tell if you are around independent charismatics, well, it's actually not that hard. So if once you kind of know what you're looking at, you can pretty much tell when you're in these spaces. They are known for having very ecstatic and experiential worship, stuff that is immersive. I mean, their worship services sometimes go on for hours, and people will even enter into almost a trance state as they worship, as they kind of immerse themselves in these kind of spiritual experiences. As I was saying, these are folks who believe in modern prophecy, not biblical prophecy, as in, oh, they're words in the Bible that have yet to be fulfilled. They believe there are actual prophets today who are walking among us, who can share the word of God with us. They are known for having this deep longing for and striving after revival, as they understand it, and not just revival in the sense of converting more people to Christianity, but revival in terms of an invigoration of the piety of the people, of Christians, of existing Christians. These folks place a very strong emphasis on what is called spiritual warfare, and that this is the idea that there's an invisible realm all around us where angels and demons are battling for control over the earth, and that those battles, that warfare affects us, especially as Christians, and that Christians can participate in that warfare through spiritual practices like prayer, like reading the Bible, at maybe the more extreme end, like performing an exorcism, right? But this is very integrated into this independent charismatic lifestyle and worldview. That not everyone in this world, but many, in fact, probably most people in this world believe in what is called the fivefold ministry. And this is going to be foreign to many people who are denominational, but it's very, very popular in the world today. And this comes out of an interpretation of Ephesians chapter 4, where the author of Ephesians lists 5 ministry gifts that are given to the church. Apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And they put a stronger emphasis on the apostles and prophets, and saying those are the roles in the church that we need to reinvigorate, we need to bring back. And then the thing that holds all this world together, because it's pretty diffuse, right? There's no denominations, there's not really institutions that hold it together. What does hold it together is media. In fact, these niche charismatic media, things like Charisma News, Charisma TV, televangelism channels, YouTube channels, prophecy channels. So there's this whole celebrity class of leaders who have emerged in this non-denominational charismatic space, who have millions of followers in many cases, but they call themselves televangelists. They might call themselves apostles, messianic rabbis. I mean, it's a wide range of titles, but they're all kind of functioning in the same celebrity ecosystem. So I want to focus in, though, on a particular set of these independent charismatic thought leaders who, as Susie mentioned, I think were central to what happened on January 6th and central to our politics right now. So my research has identified this man, C. Peter Wagner, who was a seminary professor at Fuller Seminary, which is actually my alma mater. I didn't overlap with him. He left a few years before I arrived, but I was definitely influenced by people who were influenced by him. And he came to believe that God was instigating a modern movement to renew these offices of apostles and prophets and to govern the church. He came to believe that he himself was one of these apostles, and he retired from Fuller Seminary in 1999 to go and build what he called the New Apostolic Reformation. And it's a set of leadership networks made up of these apostles and prophets, and it's not a denomination. In fact, Wagner was very clear, and he sometimes even called it the post-denominational church or post-denominational Christianity. He very much wanted to move past the paradigm of denominations. Instead, he created these relational networks with very low-grade institutions, but they're built for collaboration among these apostles and prophets. Things like the Eagles Vision Apostolic Team, Wagner's own mentoring group, things like the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, which had about 500 apostles in it at its peak under Wagner's leadership, or the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, a round table of these modern prophets who are respected around the globe. So when we think about NAR theology, and I want to outline this quickly because we are speaking Christianly here. The way that they understand the world, and this is very, very important for understanding what is going on in our politics right now, they would say, first, as I've said, there are modern day apostles and prophets who in their mind are being commissioned and empowered by the Holy Spirit to bring about this global end times revival. Now, in their interpretation of the Bible, those apostles, and this is a reinterpretation in many ways of the great Jesus' Great Commission in Matthew 28, that apostles and prophets are sent by Jesus to disciple nations. not disciple the people of the nations, not reach the people of the nations, but to disciple the nations themselves. So the nation becomes the object of the Christian mission. Not merely converting the people of the nation, not merely inspiring the values of the nation, but taking over the nation. And the way that they approach this is through what they call the seven mountains. This is a prophecy that has been integrated into this movement. And the seven mountain, or they sometimes refer to it as the seven mountain mandate, is the idea that you can divide society up into seven different arenas of influence: religion, family, government, media, business, education, arts and entertainment. And the idea is that Christians need to take over the tops of every one of those mountains. Every one of those is a mountain, and the tops of those mountains are either controlled by Satan and the demons or by Christians and God. And so Christians need to conquer all seven mountains and let Christian influence flow down from the top into society. Now, the problem in their worldview is that Satan and Satan's demons, who they believe are literal and personal, are currently hold the tops of the seven mountains. They have power over society, and so Christians need to displace those demons, need to cast them out in order to take over the seven mountains. And so this is where you get this idea of spiritual warfare. So the apostles and prophets must lead the church in waging spiritual warfare in order to defeat these hierarchies of demons and in order to take dominion over the nation. This is the theology behind January 6th. This is the theology at its root behind Christian Trumpism. This is the idea of how Christians come to power over a society. And when we come to something like the Capitol riot, part of the backstory of the Capitol riot is you had hundreds of these charismatic prophets in the lead up to the 2020 election prophesying that Donald Trump was destined to win the 2020 election, that it was God's will for Donald Trump to win the 2020 election. When Trump refuses to concede that election, these prophets declared that God would intervene miraculously to reinstate him. In fact, almost to a person, the prophets refused to recant their prophecies and said, we just need a divine intervention. We need to do spiritual warfare in order to bring about God's preferred outcome in this election. Trump is destined to win, and no matter what the polls or the news media is saying, we need to fight against this. And so you have a striking number of these apostles and prophets who show up on January 6th, including people like Cindy Jacobs and Becca Greenwood, very respected NAR prophets. You have people like Lance Wallnau, who in fact was the person who came up with the Seven Mountains idea. He was there at the Trump rally on January 6th. In fact, he was supposed to speak at one of the rallies on January 6th. Dutch Sheets, another core leader from the New Apostolic Reformation, has pioneered this other prophecy about this flag, a Revolutionary War flag called the Appeal to Heaven flag. It's a white flag you can see there with a green pine tree at the center and the phrase, an appeal to heaven, across the top. This is one of many flags that were flown over U.S. troops during the American Revolution. But Sheets believes that this flag is a prophecy about the re-Christianization of America, about appealing to heaven for a new Christian revolution in the United States. And since 2013, he has been popularizing this flag, including with people like his friend Sarah Palin there in the picture, where he is trying to get Christian lawmakers to fly this flag as a coded symbol of Christian nationalism. Another major NAR apostle named Che On spoke at a rally on January 5th, where he said, this was his declaration, his prophecy that day. We, Christians, are going to rule and reign under President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Right? So he was trying to prophesy this into existence. When it comes to January 6th itself, we see these appeal to heaven flags, this symbol of these NAR networks and leaders showing up all over the place, all around the Capitol that day. They were showing up during the rally at the Ellipse that Donald Trump and John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani spoke at. As the crowds started moving across the National Mall, we can see again these appeal to heaven flags. I think there's at least a dozen, maybe even hundreds of these in the crowds around the U.S. Capitol. As the protesters start clashing with the Capitol Police, just outside the Capitol, you can see these appeal to heaven flags. Once again, in fact, you can see videos of rioters using appeal to heaven flags on tent poles to beat down on the lines of Capitol police officers who are trying to defend the building. We can see them on the steps of the Capitol as the crowds start to breach into the Capitol. In fact, we know of at least one case in which a Capitol rioter wore an appeal to heaven flag as a cape around his neck, and he brought it into the Capitol. And when police later came to arrest him, they found the appeal to heaven flag in his home, and it was spattered with blood and with mace. And they asked him about it. He said, "That's not my blood." Since January 6th, we have seen these appeal to heaven flags continue to proliferate all over the place in our politics. We see them popping up at neo-Nazi rallies in Oregon and in New England. In fact, the flag, the black flag that's flying next to the appeal to heaven flag there is called the Sonnenrad flag. It's a version of the swastika. We know, and this was found about a year ago right now, when Mike Johnson became the Speaker of the House. My colleague Bradley Anishi and I wrote up an article describing how Mike Johnson flies an appeal to heaven flag outside of his congressional office. This was, as we dug into it and asked him about it, he revealed that it was given to him by an NAR pastor that he knows, and he's very close to a number of these NAR leaders. And then just this past summer, the New York Times revealed that Justice Samuel Alito flew an appeal to heaven flag outside of his summer home last summer in summer 2023. And of course, he blamed that on his wife. Just a couple weeks ago, J.D. Vance came to and attended a gathering led by Lance Wallnau, the same guy who came up with the Seven Mountains, the same guy who was integral to January 6th, is now doing a tour that frames itself as a revival tour of the swing states, but they're only going to the swing states. And it's actually a voter mobilization effort operating hand in glove with the Trump administration and the Trump campaign. And they are trying to gin up people to be at a high boil of hatred and anger. And that's where J.D. Vance went just a couple weeks ago, and just to kind of show his solidarity with these NAR groups. So we're in a perilous moment right now, right? We right now have a coalition of Christian supremacists who have very profound access to the Republican Party, and that party in and of itself has become a populist authoritarian threat to our democracy. So as I wrap up, I'm just going to try to speak briefly about what we can do, and I'm going to break it out into two different categories. First as Christians and then as citizens. So as Christians, I think we have to attend to and recognize and maybe even in part take responsibility for the fact that Christian supremacy is first theological and then political. And it's Christian theologies of power and domination that are at the molten core of our society's current crisis. It's not just that, oh, well, Christianity is a benign force in American politics or a neutral force. Christianity is being used right now to fuel this ideology of conquest, this ideology of disregarding the rights of some American citizens, this literal demonization of Democrats and really anyone who opposes Trump, and this glorification of Trump, this quasi-messianic attachment that many, many Christians in the country have to Donald Trump, is being fueled by these prophecies, by these ideas, by these paradigms of the Seven Mountains and Christian supremacy. And that's Christians that are doing that. And I think we need to recognize that those are Christians, those are speaking with Christian voices, speaking in our name, speaking in the name of Jesus to do these things in our society. And as Christians, I think we need to reckon with that and not merely write it off or say, oh, well, these people are kind of silly, they're kind of goofy, they're lowbrow, we don't need to deal with this. We absolutely need to deal with this because this is a very, very dangerous moment in our history. And we're coming into a season of almost endless dangerous moments. So intra-Christian theological dialogue might be the only way to diffuse this threat before it leads to more violence. Because of the protections of the First Amendment, none of the leaders that I profile in my book, none of these NAR leaders who were helping to instigate, I argue that they were the principal theological architects of the Capitol riot, none of them have faced any legal scrutiny. None of them were mentioned in the January 6th report because they're protected by the First Amendment. And they know how to come right up to the line of violence, of instigating violence, but then have plausible deniability. And so I don't think there's a legal solution to this. I don't think there's a policy solution to this. This is a civil crisis. And as Christians, we are uniquely positioned to speak into this, to speak different voices of Christianity, but then also to speak to our fellow Christians. And I do interreligious dialogue for a living. I am under no illusion about how easy this is. I know that it is much, much easier to gather liberal Jews and liberal Muslims and liberal Christians to do dialogue than to get conservative Christians and liberal Christians to talk to each other. But this stuff has grown up in theological silos in our community. And it is our responsibility to engage it and try to diffuse it. Okay, as citizens, what can we do? Well, I think, and you can disagree with me on this, I'm happy to talk about it more, but I think the 2024 election represents the worst crisis in American democracy since the election of 1860. We are so divided, so polarized, and the two candidates that are in this race present such radically different trajectories of where our country can go depending on the outcome of this. And our founding fathers actually recognized, they would call it demagoguery or the demagogue. Today we would call it populist authoritarianism. They recognized that democracy has an Achilles heel, and it is these populist authoritarian movements that emerge. And they can emerge on the left or the right. We happen to have one on the right in the United States that has taken over the Republican Party. The MAGA movement is a populist authoritarian movement, but it's not merely a political movement. It is also a religious movement, a religious nationalist movement built around these ideas of Christian supremacy. And so this is the moment that the American founders feared most, where a populist authoritarian comes to power in such a way, using the mechanisms of democracy in such a way that it can completely undermine the idea of democracy. So I think as citizens of the United States, there's some things that are within our power. We can vote, we can be activists. There's other things that are not in our power. And I think we need to recognize that some of the tide that is rising might not be reversible. But we have to take responsibility for our actions in the midst of that. And I think we need to be assessing right now, before the election happens, what are the bright lines that we have? What would it take for you to show up and protest peacefully? I'm absolutely not advocating violence. If we degrade into violence, then functionally our democracy is gone. But what are what would get you in the streets to peacefully protest? Because the New Apostolic Reformation and their fellow travelers are very, very good at putting people in the streets. And part of the reason that January 6th played out the way that it did was that there were not counter-protesters. There were not voices pushing back. And we're coming into a moment, I think, where there will be another attempt at a power grab over American democracy. And so I think those lines, whatever bright lines you have, they're going to get crossed. And you need to prepare yourself emotionally and spiritually right now. What will you do to stand up for our democracy? Because I think in the next 6 months, I will wager that some of those lines are going to get crossed. And we will need to be strong. We'll need to have some steel in our spine to stand up for the project of a pluralistic democracy. I'll stop talking. I hope, hopefully you'll still be able to sleep tonight. But I'm happy to take questions. And please, I'm not sure exactly how to facilitate this, Susie. Maybe
I can facilitate it from here.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Let's first just give him a round of applause for. What Matt does so well is provide a lot of research and dense research, right? We'll provide it in a way that's accessible. So thank you, Matt, for working on it for us. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first question, and then think about the questions you want to ask. But Matt, one of the things we have a member who's a part of Braver Angels and led a session as part of this series. As part of that was sort of encouraging us to think with empathy about those who have political positions that are different from us. So I want to challenge you to that for those who you just highlighted. Yep. What are the deep needs or fears that are driving them that we need to be conscious of as we think about dialogue and engagement without fueling polarization and dehumanization?
Yeah. I think one of the things that is at the root of our current crisis is our mentality of American exceptionalism. That we somehow think that Americans and America is better than other nations, that we imagine that these things can't happen here. And I think we need to let that go. Americans are human beings, and we have seen all around the world how democracies fall apart, and they fall apart around contested elections where authoritarian leaders refuse to relinquish power. That's how democracies die, right? And so that's the crisis that we're facing right now. But those people who are voting for Trump, those people who, even the Christian supremacists, I've talked to a number of these people and interviewed them, they're human beings. They are human beings who are hungry for power, who are fearful, who have bought into conspiracy theories and lies about the left, about these nefarious cabals that are coming after their children. They have been stoked into this state by leaders. Some of those leaders are true believers themselves, and some of them are extremely cynical. And I think we need to not view them as view our political opponents as either victims or as totally foreclosed people. I think we need to just recognize that these are our fellow citizens who are buying into these ideas. And the fact is, right now, in the United States, a third of the country believes Donald Trump's lies about the 2020 election. And that is precipitating it, not just a political crisis, not just a governance crisis, but an epistemic crisis, a crisis in how we even know what we know, right? And so part of what is driving this right now is that there is a third of the country that is not living in factual reality. And that third of the country is primed, if Donald Trump is declared the loser in this election, to once again believe his lies about the 2024 election. And I am 99.9% certain that Donald Trump will claim that this election was not legitimate if he is not the winner. That's just who he is, right? And these folks are ready to go along with it. And that is, in some sense, the crisis that we're in right now. So it's a crisis of persuasion. It's a civil crisis. It's a political crisis. It's not. This cannot be solved through the military. This cannot be solved through changing the laws. And so we as American citizens have to lean into this. And part of the challenge when you have a polarized environment and a religious nationalist movement operating within that polarized environment is that the tendency from the religious nationalist movement is to dehumanize their opponents. And you find this all over the place right now, where they are talking about the left is full of demons, Kamala Harris is a demon, or she's filled with demons. And all of that is depersonalizing things so that they can hate. If we give in to that same impulse and demonize them, call them stupid, call them crazy, call them evil, well, then that just leads to more polarization. And so I think we do have to choose the way of Jesus. Even as our fellow Christians are not choosing the way of Jesus, we have to love our enemies. We have to pray for those who persecute us. And we need to find ways of expressing Christian love, not in a namby-pamby, well, we just love her. We need to express the love of Christ for the immigrant. We need to express the love of Christ for our non-Christian sisters and brothers, our fellow citizens, who will be far more harmed if a Christian supremacist state comes to power than we will be. And we need to use the power that we have, the privilege that we have as American Christians. And I'll also say, for most of us as white people, to speak out about this. And I get very, very frustrated when I hear liberals, especially liberal Christians, and especially white liberal Christians, start making jokes. And I think there's some seriousness behind it, saying, well, at least I have an out. I'm going to move to Canada. I'm going to go to Europe. Where is our patriotism? Our country is being taken over by a neo-fascist movement. And you're having an escape plan? No, we need to stand up for our democracy. We need to fight for it. We need to have the courage of even somebody like a Volodymyr Zelensky that would say, this is my nation. And not that in a jingoistic, like, oh, my nation's better than everyone. This is my home, and I'm going to fight for it with the tools of democracy and with Christian love.
Thanks, Matt. Questions? Affirmation.
I don't know how to say this, but this is a fundamentally a Christian religious idea projected on a political background. But my question refers to more the rapture aspect of it, the idea of millennialism and post-millennialism. How much much does that play in the idea that approving that the Israeli capital will be in Jerusalem, furthering the idea of millennialism? Is that something that plays a part in this, or is it just totally American politics?
Yeah, no, oh, sorry, let me wait for the microphone. Okay, so yeah, it's a great question. Let me do a little history because I think it's important here. So in the 19th century, the dominant form of eschatology, a theology of the end of time, that in American Protestantism was what we would call postmillennial. It's this very optimistic vision of transforming culture, turning the human culture into the kingdom of God, basically. After the Civil War, this new strand of eschatology kind of took hold in the United States, and this is especially among American fundamentalists and evangelicals. This is what we would call dispensational premillennialism, or sometimes just premillennialism. This is where we get the idea of the rapture, the idea that human society is just going to degrade and get worse and worse, and Christians are going to be persecuted, and then then Jesus is going to come back and fix everything, basically, right? So you went from the optimism to the pessimism. Today, that pendulum is swinging back, and it's not simply premillennialist or simply postmillennialist. It's a weird mixture of the two. It's what in these circles would be referred to as a victorious eschatology. Their basic idea is the world is going to get worse and worse. It's going to get darker and darker, even as the church gets brighter and brighter. And the church must be militant and fight against the darkness of the world in order to bring about the Christianization of every society. So it's it's a fighting kind of eschatology. This is what is taking hold right now. This is what the Seven Mountains are about. Is about saying, here's a strategy for how to achieve Christian supremacy, not just in the United States. They want to apply this to every society and say this is how we need to conquer every society on the globe. So the theology is a big part of it, but these folks are not rapture people. They are extremely pro-Israel, not pro-Jewish, but pro-Israel, right? But even there, part of it is that Messianic Judaism is an independent charismatic movement. In fact, Messianic Judaism overlaps a lot with the New Apostolic Reformation. And so their attachment to Israel is a theological attachment, but they are also out trying to convert Jews right now to Christianity. And so it's not your grandfather's eschatology, put it that way.
Others.
I sense that liberal churches in Minnesota, these are afraid to bring up the issues of Christian nationalism out of fear of offending their conservative constituents. Is that true?
I'm not sure I can speak to the particularities of Minnesota from Baltimore, but I can. Yes, I mean many
It is
pastors.
national about what you're seeing. And if I can add a little onto that, like, do you see examples of what you were talking about with more progressive oriented Christian communities being able to engage or speak out in ways that you think reflect the Jesus? But yeah, first to that question of the perception that there's a lot of fear among clergy or clergy who are attempting to be quote unquote politically neutral in order to not foster divisions within their flocks.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of fear, and I think there's a lot of confused thinking about this relationship between religion and politics. I don't think that the churches should be out there endorsing political candidates and getting into partisan politics. I think the separation of religion and state, separation of church and state is a very, very good idea. In fact, I think it's one of the genius ideas of the American founders that has allowed for a great deal of religious freedom and religious diversity. But I do think we need to access that part of the Christian tradition that is prophetic, not in the sense of modern day prophets and everything, but the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. That I think that for too much of our Christian community and too many of our Christian leaders have been inculcated with the idea that they need to be pastoral and speak only to their flock. But we also need to speak to the world. And we also need to challenge our flocks about the world. And in the same way, I would argue that many churches, whether it be in the rising fascism of Italy in the beginning of the century or the rising fascism in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, many pastors feel intimidated. Many pastors feel like they don't want to split their congregations. They don't want to divide things further, but then they pull back. And to me, the best antidote to all of this is the character of Jesus. That is the thing that is entirely missing from the NAR's conception of the world, is the character of Jesus. They are functionally making the exact same mistake that Jesus's disciples make throughout the Gospels. They are mistaking the kingdom of God for earthly power, and they are attempting to conquer the world in the model of Rome instead of the model of Jesus. And when Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, he is, and just go read the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is living in defiance of the imperial mindset that wants to say we claim power through violence and through force. These folks are trying to claim power through violence and force, and forsaking the model of Jesus. And as Christians, that is what we need to hold up. Not to say, here's how you should vote, but here is the values, here is the character at the center of our tradition. And these folks are betraying that. They are forsaking that. And we need to hold that up for our fellow Christians. And I will just say, I've learned a lot from Jim Wallis, and Jim Wallis will sometimes say, there are some people in society that need to be persuaded. There's other people in society that need to be defeated. And right now, the NAR and these Christian supremacist networks need to be defeated. But there are many Christian nationalists who are persuadable. If you look at the survey data on Christian nationalism, look at Pew, look at PRRI, there are a lot of people who are attached to Christian nationalism, again, for these kind of sentimental reasons. They're like, oh, Christianity is good. We wouldn't want more Christianity. They aren't thinking about their Jewish or Muslim or atheist neighbor. They aren't thinking about the downstream consequences of that way of thinking for the immigrant community. They're just kind of living their blissful little Christian lives. And we need to be able to pierce through that and say that there's real peril here. And we need to hold up the witness of the gospel to them and say, this is the character of Jesus. How do you reconcile that with the way these folks are living and talking? And you even are coming to the point where you have Christian leaders who are functionally mocking the words of Jesus and saying, this is not a time to love our enemies. This is not a time to turn the other cheek. This is not a time to bless those who persecute us. And to them, I would just say that then you have embraced the religion of the Antichrist, because the Christ says all of the Christ did not equivocate or give any caveats to those statements. That is just the way of being Christian. And I think we need to call our fellow Christians to that in this moment.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, Reverend Sarah Campbell. Question.
I have really immersed myself in the Confessing Christian Church work this summer, and am convinced that silence is consent, and that preachers right now, this may be a time to risk your job if you're in a purple or red church. Silence is consent. Wonder if you can comment on that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that silence right now is consent. And I do think that there are moments of crisis in a society that require us to set aside some of the niceties. And I think we need to be able to speak about Christian supremacy and not pull our punches on that. I take great inspiration from the Muslim community in America. My first book is about the Muslim community and the way that it responded to 9/11. And I was especially focused on what would be called radical Islam, the Salafi movement. And what's incredible is after 9/11, in a moment of real crisis, right? A moment of surging Islamophobia, in the moment of government crackdown on Muslim communities, Muslim leaders and Muslim communities in the United States decided, we're going to lean in to being American. We're going to lean into pluralistic democracy, and we're going to take a stand for against even the radical voices in our own midst, the militant voices in our own midst, but we're not going to cast those people out. We're going to dialogue with them. We're going to draw them in. We're going to defuse and defang some of these radical ideas that are living on the margins of our community. And today, the Muslim community is very well integrated into the life of American democracy, into our pluralism, into our voting. And I think we need to take a lesson from that, that it's our job as Christians to defang Christian extremism. That's not somebody else's job. That role does not belong to the government or to some other group of people. We are the ones who can speak the language of Christian theology. We are the ones who can stand against this stuff. And I think Christian leaders need to be doing that, but individual Christians need to be doing that as well, in their families, in their neighborhoods, with their school boards, right? And part of the beauty of the separation of church and state is that we did not go too far, I think, in our American law to say religious voices are not welcome in the public sphere. Religious voices are always welcome in the public sphere in American democracy. The problem is that public sphere right now is being dominated by a certain set of Christian voices who have adopted these extremely toxic bastardizations of the Christian tradition in order to promote their own will to power. And if we're going to speak the gospel, it has to be in contradiction of these false gospels that are being presented. And I'm sorry, but there are worse things than losing your job.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more if there's any pressing. Okay.
Thanks for your time. Okay, I admit that 2016 election, I took solace in the idea of moving to Canada, as we sort of joked around. Now I take solace in the fact that Trump is getting very old. But do you think that this movement will last beyond Trump?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it will definitely last beyond Trump. What form it will last in, I don't know. Donald Trump has cultivated a unique relationship with these, especially independent charismatic Christian supremacists that I have not seen another political leader figure out how to do that. And their attachment to him really is bordering on messianic. I mean, they view him as a sort of a secular savior for American Christianity. And no, J.D. Vance, many people have tried to kind of step in or highlight themselves as an heir apparent. I've not seen anyone be successful yet. So if Donald Trump died tomorrow, I don't know what would happen. I will say that the assassination attempts that have happened this past summer have only cemented these narratives about Donald Trump being a figure of destiny. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, was on a prayer call led by some of Trump's evangelical advisors. And he told the story of being at Mar-a-Lago right after the second assassination attempt and how he spent several hours with Trump and described how he told Trump, this is the hand of God that has saved you. And this is not an accident that your life has been spared these two times. God has a destiny and a purpose for you. And he goes on to say on that call, I believe, he said, it is apparent to me that God has once again chosen Donald Trump to be the president over this country and to lead us for another term. That's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the second in line for the presidency, making a theological statement that God has chosen Donald Trump. So this is very dangerous. And I think we do need yes, we need to be prepared for this stuff to last for quite a while. These folks have tasted power. They're not going back. They're not retreating back into the hinterlands. They are now deeply ensconced into the entirety of the Republican Party. I mean, you can see the leaders from the top three branches, at the top of all three branches of our government, Trump, Alito, and Johnson, have all embraced the symbolism of the NAR. So they are well entrenched in that party. They're not going to relinquish power easily.
Matt, in 30 seconds, if folks want to read more of your work, dive into this a little bit more, do you any books you recommend or podcasts?
Yes, so my book that just came out on October 1st is called The Violent Ticket by Force, and it tells the whole story of January 6th and the NAR and in much more depth than I could do today. I also did a podcast series called Charismatic Revival Fury that you can just Google that and you can find the podcast that runs through a lot of this material as well, and that's entirely free. And then I work at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, and feel free to sign up for all of our free programs and education things and things on religious bias and bigotry. We welcome people from the community to do that.
Matt, thank you. The work that you're doing is a gift to American community.
Well, thank you all for being with me in it.
It was a gift to have you with us today. Thanks, everybody, for showing up.
Thank you all. God bless.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll stop.
Very.
I think here we go.